Good evening. My name is John Beck, and I am a professor in the School of Human Resources and Labor Relations here at Michigan State University. But for the purpose of tonight, the important relationship I have is as an honors college professor who's in charge of our series called Sharper Focus, Wider Lens. Tonight, we have a wonderful panel to discuss the topic, Digging Up the Past, New Subjects, New Tools. All of the people on tonight's panel are not necessarily historians, but many of them are. But they're all using different interesting tools to look at the past, as we'll find out in a few minutes.
Is the microphone working?
What's that?
Is the microphone working?
Yes, the microphone is working, yeah. So what I'm going to do is just also introduce my partner in crime, Stephanie Sepak. Stephanie is a communication director for the Honors College, and she'll be rotating around the audience tonight with a microphone in terms of getting any questions from the audience after all of our panelists have presented. There. I think that now we can hear it. Now, the Honors College continues to be proud to sponsor Sharper Focus, Wider Lens. It gives us in the Honors College and across the campus a chance to showcase faculty, academic staff, and other staff here at MSU and the research that's going on. This celebrates the work that happens here in a way that lets the local community, students, faculty, and staff exchange ideas about big topics. We never answer all the questions, we actually come up with more, and the intent is that the dialogue will continue beyond tonight. So now let me introduce our panel for Digging Up the Past, New Subjects, New Tools. On my far right is Siddharth Chandra. He is a professor in James Madison College and the director of the Asian Studies Center. Siddharth's research interests include behavior and policy relating to addictive substances, the intersection of economics, health, and history in Asia, and applications of portfolio theory to fields outside of finance. He has received funding from the National Institutes of Health and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for his research, which has been published in a variety of journals. At James Madison College, he teaches a senior seminar titled Drug Policy from Asia to America, in which students learn about different approaches to drug policy in Asia and the United States. Siddharth earned his doctorate from Cornell University. On his left and on my right, Stacey is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology and director of the Michigan State University Campus Archaeology program. Stacey researches how social inequality manifests through material culture and environment. Her current research project involves archaeological and archival research on a World War II internment camp in Idaho, where first-generation Japanese migrants were imprisoned as enemy aliens by the United States government. Stacey's first book, The Archaeology of Citizenship, examined how different marginalized groups, especially migrants in the United States, made claims to nationality and citizenship via material culture. She earned her doctorate from Stanford University. On my immediate right, and hopefully soon to take the table, is Glenn Chambers Jr. Dr. Chambers is an associate professor in the Department of History and the director of the African American and African Studies program. His research and teaching centers on the African diaspora with a focus on the modern Caribbean and Latin America, intersecting with histories of colonialism in the Caribbean, labor, nationalism, race relations, and immigration and migration. His book, Race, Nation, and West Indian Immigration to Honduras, 1890 to 1940, explores these themes. His current research project, tentatively titled From the Banana Zones to the Big Easy, Honduran Immigration to New Orleans and Changing Perceptions of Race and Place in a Divided City, 1910 to 1945, continues in this vein and explores West Indian and Afro-Latino, Central American, immigration to New Orleans in the early 20th century and their integration and adjustment into a highly racialized Jim Crow New Orleans. He earned his doctorate from Howard University. On my immediate left, Sharon Leon. Leon is an associate professor in the Department of History. Sharon is a historian of American religion with a concentration on U.S. Catholicism. She also specializes in digital methods with a focus on public history. With support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, she is analyzing experiences of the cohort of people enslaved and sold by the Maryland province Jesuits in the 18th and 19th centuries. Sharon's first book was An Image of God, The Catholic Struggle with Eugenics. She earned her doctorate from the University of Minnesota. Last but not least, on my far left, Kaye is an assistant professor in the Department of History. Noah is an ancient historian and archaeologist focused on the Eastern Mediterranean in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, with an interest in the relationship between economic and cultural change. His first book will be a study of the political economy of the Attalid Kingdom of Pergamon. In spring 2020, Noah will be teaching History 481, the Holy Land in the Greco-Roman period. He earned his doctorate from the University of California, Berkeley. With no further ado, Dr. Chandra.
Thank you, Professor Beck. So I'm going to talk about digging up the past using census data, and my focus is going to be genocide, pandemics, and then I'm going to focus on one instance of genocide, and that's the Indonesian killings of 1965-1966. So let me make this a slideshow, and we'll go from the beginning. Right. So the past is replete with events of large population loss. We see this in countries across the world. These events are often precipitated by pandemics. Probably the most prominent example is the Spanish influenza of 1918, which is estimated to have killed between 50 and 100 million people worldwide in the span of just a year. But then we also have many incidents of genocide and politicide, perhaps the most famous of which is the Holocaust during the Second World War in Europe. Being director of the Asian Studies Center at Michigan State University, I look at incidents that have not received as much attention as the Holocaust has from scholars. And the two events that I'm studying right now are the genocide in Bangladesh in 1971 and the politicide or political genocide in Indonesia of 1965. So among the questions, one of the issues that repeatedly arises is because these events occur and create great upheaval in the societies at the time at which they are occurring, we know very little about them. People are not busy keeping records when a pandemic is sweeping a country or there's a genocide or a war. And so one of the very fundamental questions about these kinds of events is how many people died? And when we start looking at geography in more detail, we may want to ask the question of why did the toll vary across locations? What are the kinds of factors that determine a pandemic hits particular regions more than others, or a politicide, the impact is felt more in some places than others? It turns out that censuses can provide answers to some of these questions. And specifically, if censuses exist in these locations, we can look at what's happening in these locations before and after these events. We can try to calculate what populations might have been before and after the events to get an idea of how severe these events were in their impact on different regions. So the basic idea here is to observe populations before and after the events, and then to compute the number of people who are not in a location who should be there, in which case you have a shortfall just after the event. And in some instances, we are quite surprised to find that there are more people in a location than should be there, and we need to start asking questions as to why that's the case. So I'll give you a very quick example. This is the case of Indonesia in 1965-66. This was a situation in which the Communist Party of Indonesia was essentially exterminated, primarily by the Indonesian army, but also in collaboration with the political opponents of the Communist Party of Indonesia. And the way we do these calculations is we have census data on what's happening in Indonesia in 1960, 1971, and 1980. Those are represented by the 3 dots on the graph. And what you can do is, because you know that between 1971 and 1980, which are the 2 dots on the right side of the graph, nothing major happened by way of population loss, you can calculate the rate at which the population was growing between those 2 years. And that's the red line joining those 2 dots on the right side of the graph. Now, once you've calculated the rate at which the population is growing, you can project it backward in time, and those are the green dots leading back to the time of the upheavals, which is in 1965. And that gives you an idea of what the population would have been after the killings. All right? Using the growth rate that we computed along the red line, we can then apply that to the population that we observed in 1960, and that's the red dot to the left of the graph, and we can project it forward in time along the blue line to get an idea of what the population would have grown to prior to the killings, okay? And what you see, those little black dots, the vertical line in the middle of the graph represents the population that's missing that should be there, okay? And because censuses are carried out at very detailed levels of geography, we can do these computations for dozens and dozens and dozens of districts and create a picture of what's happening across an entire province. So this is what our project consists of. It's very different from another approach, and that is the telling of stories, which is incredibly important and which we use to enrich our interpretation of what these numbers are telling us. And that there's a lot of material on. So let me show you a map of what happens in the province of East Java in Indonesia. This was one of the worst affected provinces by this genocide. So this is the map, and the red areas show you areas of population loss. The darker is the red, the higher is the percentage loss. These are areas that lose 10% or more, the really dark red. And what really surprised us when we were doing this research is there were some areas that were blue, and these are areas that show population gain. And that begs the question as to what's going on. Because in all the anecdotes and all the stories that we hear, people are talking about loss. They're never talking about increases in numbers of people, and they're certainly not talking about systematic migration, which is the phenomenon that we observe here, all right? So what you see is on the southern coast of Java, we have a lot of increases in population, and on the northern coast is where we are observing declines, okay? So let me go on to a couple of other issues. First, do these data match what we are hearing in the stories, right? And I'm going to tell you one story very quickly and show you that, in fact, we find some compelling evidence that they match. So after 1966, the Indonesian army, which was carrying out the exterminations, got wind from its intelligence agencies that the communists were, in fact, running away and regrouping in different parts of the island. And they mounted an operation to eliminate the remnants of the Communist Party, after which they wrote a report. And their report actually contained a map showing what the intelligence agency had told them. The intelligence agency had told them that the communists were regrouping in areas marked by the large circles on this map. Okay? So focus on any one of the large circles, and I'm now going to play this map forward and show and tell me what color you see within those large circles. So if we page down to the map showing population gain or loss, what color do you see in the large circles? What you should see is blue, right? Representing increases in population. So this suggests that our calculations are not just complete guesswork, they actually match with something that we observe, okay? I'll give you one more example of a factor associated with the violence and then stop. We know that people tend to run to areas where the terrain is difficult, where there are jungles, where there aren't many roads, and it's easy to hide. So this map shows you how rough the terrain is in different parts of the island. You'll see circular areas where the color is dark red. That's where the terrain is the most rough, all right? These are volcanoes. The island of Java is dotted with volcanoes. And if you look at where people are running, so take a look at any of those red areas, the dark red areas, and what you'll see is they tend to match up with dark blue areas. So a second piece of evidence is people are running for the hills or running for where the countryside is rough and they think they will not be found. Okay? So I'm going to stop by concluding that census data can be a valuable resource for understanding genocide and pandemics. We've done work on the flu pandemic in the US, in Michigan, and in other states. And sometimes you find things that you don't expect, in this case, mass migration.
And by the way, we'll have plenty of time a little bit later to ask questions and everything else of Dr. Chandra. So now we'll turn to Dr. Camp.
Thank you for having me on this really timely panel. I'm a historical archaeologist who studied different migrant groups in the Western US, including Chinese, Japanese, and Mexican migrants. As an archaeologist, I spend most of my time digging, counting, weighing, cleaning, and analyzing the minutiae that people discard and trash. Shards of broken bottle glass, fragments of plates and cups, worn down toothbrushes. That's the bread and butter of what I do as a historical archaeologist. After years and years of field and laboratory research, I'm able to reconstruct how many medicine bottles people had and how many plates and cups people owned. This may sound very quotidian, but this kind of work, when guided by research questions, can answer some very important questions about the past. My more recent project, and by recent I mean the last 10 years, has examined the archaeology of World War II Japanese American internment and incarceration. My current research site, the Kuski internment camp, is in rural Idaho, where over 260 Japanese Americans were incarcerated. These men were considered enemy aliens by the United States government because they were non-citizens. However, they were not able to acquire legal citizenship during the time they lived in the US due to the racially exclusionary laws of the time. These men were community leaders, pastors and priests, and well-liked businessmen. Their only crime was of being Japanese heritage. They represent the minority of Japanese Americans incarcerated during the war. The majority were American citizens like myself who hadn't committed any crimes. Japanese American non-citizens were generally incarcerated in Department of Justice facilities separate from Japanese American citizens who were incarcerated in War Relocation Authority prisons. One of the questions I've been trying to address through archaeological research on incarceration is how these two different populations, citizens and non-citizens, were treated during World War II incarceration. One might assume that Japanese American citizens were given better health care, medicine, food, and access to leisure and recreation in War Relocation Authority camps simply because they were legal American citizens. However, my research suggests this was not the case. Because Japanese American non-citizens were considered prisoners of war, they were supposed to be treated by the stipulations outlined in the Geneva Convention. This required that prisoners were to be given access to dental, ophthalmological, and health care, foods to which they were accustomed, recreation facilities, and certain types of foods and goods, such as tobacco and alcohol. Surprisingly, my analysis of healthcare-related artifacts suggests that Japanese American non-citizens were treated better than Japanese American citizens, though when Japanese American non-citizens arrived to prisons, they came prepared for the worst, bringing products with which they were familiar prior to incarceration. One example of this attempt at self-care can be seen in this Wakamoto pharmaceutical bottle, which was manufactured in Japan between 1929 and 1943 and would have been brought into Kuski by a prisoner. It was a gastrointestinal supplement. Wakamoto Pharmaceutical is still in business today, and when we emailed them about this bottle, they sent us a historic advertisement like the one seen up here. When Kuski's Japanese American non-citizen prisoners arrived at Kuski in May 1943, they discovered they were not being given the provisions and facilities outlined in the Geneva Convention. After petitioning the US government over what prisoners saw as an egregious violation of the Geneva Convention, the government quickly responded by providing a dentist, a doctor, and ophthalmological care. The success of their petition can be witnessed in the archaeological record. Prescription eyeglasses and sunglasses, as well as numerous bottles of Murray's eye serum, a serum used to remedy eye pain, and sunglasses were recovered from Kuski. A Japanese manufactured toothbrush, the only one of its kind found at World War II incarceration sites, was also recovered from Kuski, once again suggesting that prisoners did not expect to have their basic needs met by the US government while incarcerated. Archaeological research at Kuski also recovered numerous dental-related objects, including a dental tray, denture molds, which were reflective of the prisoners' advanced ages, most of them were in their 50s and 60s, and tooth molds. These objects and medications are not found in other archaeological excavations of World War II internment camps that house Japanese American citizens, suggesting that this medical care for Japanese American non-citizens was due to the government's concern about violating the Geneva Convention. This was of great concern to our government because a violation could result in the mistreatment or even death of Anglo-American POWs. So my research on Kuski has led me to ask bigger questions about World War II incarceration and to seek out new technologies for answering them. A few years ago, I received funding to develop an online database of all the artifacts recovered from Kuski. This will allow other scholars to compare and contrast archaeological data from other World War II incarceration sites in the United States with my data from the Kuski internment camp. Recently, I've sought out funding to support expanding this digital presence so that the experiences of all World War II incarcerees, German POWs, Italian POWs, and Japanese Americans in the US can be explored so that scholars can make definitive statements about the treatment of different types of World War II prisoners, non-citizens, citizens, and prisoners of varying ethnic backgrounds. The application of technology to the past can thus shed light on how incarceration was experienced by US-based prisoners during World War II. Thank you for your time.
Great, well, thank you so much. Let me just do that and turn it over to Dr. Leon.
Get our mic on. And then, let's see if we can get the slideshow running. There's our play button. There we go. Mac user trying to use a PC. So my current project involves questions of how to ethically represent the lives of enslaved people. I am working on a group of enslaved people who, in 1838, were collectively sold by the Maryland Province Jesuits. The Jesuits, an order of Catholic priests who had been in first the colony and then the state of Maryland since its founding in 1634. And they owned a large community of enslaved people across the period between 1634 and 1838. And in 1838, 275 of those people were sold to two individuals in Louisiana, Henry Johnson, who was a former governor, and Jesse Beatty, who was a physician. This landmark sale made most of the future ventures of the Jesuits in missionary outposts and educational ventures in Maryland, up and down the East Coast and into the West possible. So if we take a look at this letter from this excerpt of a letter from 1839 between one Jesuit and another, it says, "All our married people who had married out of our farms have been sold to the masters of their husbands or wives, or to the next neighbors of them, so that husbands and wives are together. But some children who could not be sold with their mothers have been sent with the others to Louisiana. There remain in our farms only a few old people, well provided for their lifetimes. So old Isaac remained at White Marsh." After the 1838 sale, this brief note from one Jesuit to another encapsulates some of the brutality related to the breaking up and parceling out of these families. Husbands and wives tried to be kept together, but in some cases, children ripped apart from their parents through these basically economic transactions. And yet, Isaac is the way that many people who know about this community enter into this story. Isaac was the head of a very large family, one of the largest extended families amongst this initial group. They lived on the White Marsh Plantation in Prince George's County. Isaac's wife was not owned by the Jesuits, but he had 4 sons and a daughter and 16 grandchildren. And if you were able to see this side more closely, it's hard to tell because the family is so large, the print is very small. There's Isaac II and Isaac III. Isaac III is 4 years old at the point of sale. His father, Isaac II, is 26. The reason people know Isaac is that he is the very first name on this very large census of enslaved people. A Jesuit went through all the farms, the 5 farms that the community owned in 1837, and totaled up all of the people and their ages and where they lived prior to the sale. The other reason people know Isaac Hawkins' name is that a building on campus at Georgetown University has been renamed after him. Originally, it was named after Thomas Mulledy, who was one of the Jesuits who executed the sale. But we can derive an awful lot of data from this list by itself about this initial community. You can see across, if we sort out people by ages, there's an enormous number of children under the age of 10 in this group, 83 of the 275, and then there's a huge group who are past the age of service, according to the Jesuits and their buyers in Louisiana. Lots of people over the age of 50. We can also see that amongst this group there are large extended family relationships. This is a social network graph that just looks at this 1838 group, and you can see the tight ties and the many generations there. The project that I am working on employs a variety of digital humanities and digital history methods to look at not only the sale community, but all of the people who went before them. It turns out that most of the work about this community has focused on that 275 group of people, but there are many, many, many hundreds more. For many years, historians have not told this story from the perspective of the enslaved group, but rather focused on the Jesuits and their decision-making as enslavers, and why to own people and also why to sell them. But by using digital methods of linked open data and data visualization, along with narrative interpretation, I'm working to understand this group as a whole. And through my research, I've surfaced, let's say, over 1,100 people, men, women, children, brothers and sisters, cousins, aunts and uncles. These clearly represented family relationships, in some cases 4 generations deep in families, and a whole associated set of life course events: births, deaths, marriages, baptisms, labor events, sickness and health conditions, transfers, and those sorts of things. So we can see an awful lot of change over time with this community. The first appearance of the enslaved community in the Jesuit records is actually in 1717. There are 15 people listed at Newtown. There's parity amongst the gender of the adults in that group, and there are 7 children with that group of 15. There's a major spike in the community in 1729 when a wealthy Catholic planter, James Carroll, dies and leaves his enslaved people and his land to the Jesuits. And there's significant talk of manumitting this community, selling for a term of years between the periods of 1813 and 1820. But the Jesuits back off from that period. But if we take a look at the transactions, the freedom transactions versus the birth transactions over time, we get to start to see some spikes in areas and events where we would want to investigate further. But we can also do close reading. And here we meet George and Flora, who were married in the 1770s. You can see they have 7 children here. 4 of those children died between 1790 and 1793, which would encourage us to ask what was going on there. Was there a major fire or something like that? It turns out, from other records, we find that the Jesuits are inoculating their populations on other farms, that there's a smallpox outbreak, and this family loses 4 children to the smallpox epidemic in the early 1790s. So by toggling between these methods of applying a wider lens and close reading, I'm hoping to look at individual stories and to derive a collective understanding of these community experiences over about 125 years.
Well, thank you, Dr. Leon. And now, Dr. Kaye.
Down there on the bottom. Using the right side of the mouse.
Okay. I'm going to talk about something called the Hellenistic World and about something called numismatics, which is a study of coins. It's a very old form of humanistic research, but today can be applied to do economic history and to look at culture contact in this very interesting period of world history called Hellenistic. So what's Hellenistic? You know, it's a word, a modern word that means something like Greekish. So what that's implying is that it's a period of world history in which Hellenism interacted with a great number of cultures in the Near East and in Egypt. It followed the conquest of Alexander the Great, who built on the ruins of the Achaemenid Persian Empire a very short-lived Greco-Macedonian successor state that then broke up into a number of pieces, some of which were run by his generals and some of which were indigenous responses to the model of kingship and empire that he brought eastward. Here's a picture of some of those successor states to Alexander. So what happens inside these states is what interests me in my research, both the political economy, how were they run, and what were the boundaries between different cultures. What's really interesting about this period isn't just the interaction, but the new that comes out of these combinations, really, of different cultures. So a nice example would be what happens in the city of Alexandria, right? Very famous for its library, which in a sense is preserving or classicizing Greek culture. But there's a lot of newness there too. When Zeus is combined with Osiris, something like a new god, Serapis, emerges. This can also be blown out to talk about, well, where did Christianity come from? Really, it's the combination of Judaism and Hellenism, in part, that produces the phenomenon of Christianity. So that's the dynamic of world history in this period. Now, can we see that in a little artifact like a coin? I think so. Greeks are in India, they're in what is today Afghanistan, Bactria, and there are fascinating developments in the history of art, such as Gandharan art, that show the give and take. And we see here an image from Greco-Indian history on a coin, of course, and Alexander the Great. In my research, I'm working in Anatolia, so contemporary Turkey. It's highland steppe interior. And here we had an interaction between the Latin civilization of Iron Age Europe, came to be known as the Celts, who migrated into the Balkans and from the Balkans into Asia, Western Asia, and then became known there as the Galatians. Right? They're Gauls and they're Galatians, and these are the Celts of Anatolia. And so to study them, it's very difficult because we're at a loss for sources written in their own name. We have a few hilltop forts and remote parts of central Turkey, such as the one before you. But coins can show us these Celts taking on Greek ways, a whole Greek way of life that's attendant upon the adoption of the city, the polis, as an organizing principle. So I want to show you where we get these coins from, because I know it's about digging up the past. I'm totally ashamed now to say I'm an archaeologist harvesting this data, not from the earth. Actually, excavation coins, right? I'm sure it's true in Wyoming from the 20th century, Idaho, are sometimes close to illegible, often so, right? So one place where we can read coins is when they come off the antiquities market. The antiquities market in coins is enormous. Right? And every year, auction catalogs are issued with the data of the coins that travel through licit and illicit means between countries and between collections. And in the case of these Galatians, we were able in the last few years to reconstruct their adoption of the Greek polis as the polity in which they lived very briefly at the turn from the 2nd to the 1st century BC from a coin that you see before you. And to put the story in context, it's really not that different than what Judeans were doing at exactly the same time in Jerusalem, where the young priests of the Jerusalem temple adopted not just Greek trappings, but Jerusalem was refounded as a Greek polis precisely then on the eve of what became known as the Maccabean Revolt, and saw the birth of martyrdom, and had a great effect on the religious history of the world. It turns out Galatian priests, Celtic priests in Anatolia, were involved in a similar cultural game and political transformation at that time. And we know this from a single coin harvested from an auction catalog. So one way we dig up these coins is by looking through databases of auction catalogs. But we also want to have remote means of pulling all of this information together in collections, museum collections. If we were to digitize coins with a common signature, for lack of a better term, open link data allows us to make coin records machine readable, and you get these kinds of heat maps. I'm showing Ephesus here as an example. So this is a way we track coins and their movement across this world. And my takeaway would be that the world I've just described to you is obviously culturally complex, but also much more economically complex than classical Greece. And coinage shows us that across these boundaries of the different kingdoms, of cultural difference, people are interacting economically, and we can track that quite well. No one is able to seal themselves off, even if they want to, and we're able to see that by harvesting this data from these little artifacts, the coins that appear to us in records of collectors and in machine-read data. Thanks.
Well, thank you all for those wonderful presentations. I'm going to just make a couple of quick remarks, then we're going to open it up for crosstalk across the panel. Then we're going to open it up to all of you for whatever questions and comments you have. I think that you see across these presentations a great amount of interesting convergence. The importance not only of qualitative data, but quantitative data. As Dr. Chandra has already said to us, that often we understand genocides or other events through memoir of individual survivors rather than necessarily those who perished. And being able to track something like the Indonesian genocide, which very well may not have a lot of people who are writing memoirs of that specific period, gives us an opportunity to have a glimpse into something that we couldn't see otherwise. I find especially interesting, and maybe everyone else was touched by this, to understand the importance of geography, the importance, frankly, of where it's rough to live versus where it's easy to live, and how that is going to change the flow of people across something like the islands, Java and other places within Indonesia. I think that Dr. Kamp's presentation really shows all of us the importance of what we take for granted. what we value, what we discard, and the fact that something very well may have been so important to someone because it gave them a glimpse of home, a glimpse of the familiar, in the midst of, in this case, the repression of actually living in a camp. The importance of understanding that within the notion of collective experience, because these are not only individuals who are imprisoned or interned, this is a whole group of people who have collective experiences across the various communities from which they come. They create their own experiences within those camps as well. And it's really interesting to try to figure out what can we learn from what they held in common, what they valued in common, and what they valued or held uniquely. I think Dr. Leon really helps us understand, just like the other two so far, that people without history are often at the historical point of always what is told by their captors, what is told by their bosses, what is told by their owners. And that often the history is told, as we've been told many times in history courses, by the winners and by the powerful rather than necessarily by the powerless. I think that it's especially poignant that the idea that someone might want to show their philanthropy by actually willing their human beings to the church. I mean, if that I find it almost like an oxymoron to believe somehow that would be the height of your tithing to the church. And last but not least, Dr. Kaye really opens up for us the fact that we know so much, at the same time we know so little about the ancient world, where there are many kingdoms that rose and fell in the wake of Alexander that are only the province of classical historians, where these are not necessarily household names, whether it be Galatia or Bactria and others. The importance of image, the fact that images are so important to us, that we put them on coins, that it tells us who we believe in God, or it tells us who we believe in terms of our actual rulers. I find it fascinating that as you were talking about the rise of Christianity and you're talking about coinage, automatically I thought of the render unto Caesar what is Caesar and render unto God what is God's. The importance of coinage and the image of the empire, in effect, on the coin. And last but not least, both where the coins show up in terms of the actual auctions, but also the notion of movement across geography of coinage, that gold is gold no matter whose image happens to be on that specific metal, and that many of these coins, I am sure, traveled all over the Hellenistic world in one way or another, and it shows us patterns of trade, it shows us patterns of migration, and other kinds of movements within that time frame. I think we've had a rich tapestry across our 4 presentations of really trying to understand the past, and we've heard about the importance of electronic databases. We've learned the importance maybe for many of us for the first time of harvesting auctions rather than simply going out into the field and digging stuff up. We've heard about the importance of looking for the populations that don't exist, and for the idea of trying to create a larger and larger network analysis using all of these tools together in the case of the Georgetown slaves. So with that, let me first invite our panelists to comment on each other's presentations or any questions or threads that you see running through this, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Any comments from anyone in terms of anything that's been set up here? Anyone want to jump in?
I do. I want Dr. Chandra's data. I want the regularity of the well extracted census data. I'm working, a couple centuries before with very, very uneven and incomplete data, where I could provide you with a graph of inventories that tells us nothing predictive because they are so uneven in the ways in which they're gathered and marked. And so I'm jealous of your data, sir.
Well, but that raises an interesting question. Often we find that we can't trust government sources. Are these trustworthy sources in terms of what you're using?
Right. So thank you for that, and I think these are both important issues. So to respond to your issue about the data, these events are all too common, unfortunately. We've seen these things happen around the world, and there are very few such events for which we actually have enough census data before and after that we can do this kind of analysis. So this happens to be one. And the reason we undertook this analysis was that unlike the Holocaust, in which the perpetrators lost, and so the data immediately became available, and there were people, talking about their experiences and so on immediately after the end of the Second World War. In the case of Indonesia, the perpetrators won. And so for 30 years, the key beneficiary, President Suharto, maintained an environment in which you weren't allowed to say very much. So this is why those memories are being lost, and so falling back on census data becomes really important. Are they reliable? Well, it turns out in many areas these census data, especially for 1961, are not very reliable. But of all the census data, the number that I think most demographers will agree is the most reliable is the head count, right? You go to a house, you count the number of people in the household, there are 5 people, hard to argue. When you start asking people their ages, they tend to round up and down. We have a phenomenon called age heaping. When you talk about gender, sometimes you have issues because people don't want to tell you, for example, in some places how many women there are in the household. So we were very careful about that. We used just head count data because we felt those were the most reliable. The other question is there an agenda behind the way the numbers are reported? And we know of no agenda that might have been in place to try to skew these numbers so that they'd give us a wrong idea of what happened during the killings. And so we feel, at least in that area, the numbers are not biased in any deliberate manner. Great.
Other comments? Nora, do you want to grab
I
a...
have a question for Stacey, but I can't resist commenting that I'm about to teach the restoration of Augustus, early Roman Empire, and there's a inscription in Ankara, Turkey, where Augustus tells his events on the side of a temple, and he gives some few millions as the population of the Roman Empire. And it's so confusing. Who's he counting? We have a high count and a low count for the Roman Empire that are off by millions. So it's something as basic. We even have a number, but we don't know what kind of number we have in our world. And when we do have one, my question, Stacey, your story reminded me of all the surprise in archaeology. This thing where people ask us, what are we looking for? And we say, we're led by questions and we see what we find, and that's real archaeology. And I just was wondering how the process worked for you in terms of your hypothesis and what you found and how you went about it. Did you went out there with the question, how would citizenship potentially have affected the way the people in this camp were treated? Did you have a hunch, and then your hunch was overturned, and then you found this Geneva Convention angle to explain? How did it work in terms of hypothesis, surprise, dealing with the results?
Well, thank you. So I originally went out there to study how people envision themselves in relationship to the nation, and how their consumption patterns might reflect that, because it was kind of building off my previous research on Mexican migrants and Chinese migrants and how they envision themselves as racialized populations in the US. And so My research questions changed once I started reading deep into the literature and talking to descendant groups and really understanding what are the bigger, broader questions people wanted answered. And there was a medical anthropologist who had been studying how people were treated in the WRA camps, Japanese American citizens, and had done all this research on the topic. And so I started looking at my own data set and what we were finding in the archaeological record. And I thought, you know what, we can answer some of these questions and compare and contrast the experiences of Japanese American non-citizens and citizens using this person's data set, which is a different data set, right? But I think you can do that, comparing the archives and comparing the archaeology, because I do that as a historical archaeologist all the time. So yeah, I actually had a question for you, Noah. And this is probably a tangent, but I'm wondering if coinage was used in non-coinage or non-economic ways, because I know that's true with like Chinese coinage. I don't know if you've studied that, but I know Native Americans in the West use Chinese coinage as a way of decorating their clothing and kind of as a trade good.
Yes. We have on the periphery of the Mediterranean, which is sort of one of the most highly monetized parts of our historical geography in the West. People using coinage in ways that require an anthropologist to understand. But we're starting to realize that it's not, maybe it's us sometimes, we don't understand what people are doing with coinage in places like Southeastern Europe, or just on this example of Central Anatolia, it was thought, I mean, people copy, and there are so-called barbarous Alexanders from Saudi Arabia, from Thrace, contemporary Bulgaria, and there are copies of the prestige monies of the day here in Central Anatolia. But that's something different than you're talking about a non-monetary use of coinage, right? And as totems and the like, I can think of as amulets. I think we have some evidence for that, but I think we now see that at the periphery of the Mediterranean, the world in which coinage makes sense doesn't just stop at a sharp halt, but that coinage cedes to other monetary systems that are complex in their own way, and the phenomenon of imitation shows that. But these images travel through imitation, and the backstory of Islam is very hard to reconstruct, right? Pre-Islamic Arabian archaeology, and one of the sources are these coins, imitated versions of Alexander's coins that are found all over the Persian Gulf.
Other questions for each other? Yes.
I have a couple of questions.
Oh, Siddharth, use the mic if you
Right. So one is, you draw this distinction between citizen and non-citizen internees, and that their health outcomes were different, perhaps because of the kind of medicine that they use. Is this an assimilation story, an acculturation story? And what does that tell us about the process of acculturation and assimilation in the early 20th century? And my other question was directed more to both of you in your presentation. I saw networks. I'm a quantitative scholar. And of course, the moment I see networks, there are all kinds of very interesting structural features of the network that you can tease out from the pattern. And the same applies, by the way, to networks of coinage, right? So you have nodes on a map. Presumably there's a linkage if the mint is sort of at the center of everything and you find these coins all over. Have you explored the use of network analysis to try to understand better these worlds? And are there ways in which the networks change over time that perhaps might tell you about the formation and breakup of empires and about the formation and maybe breakup of family structures?
Anybody want to jump in?
answer the first question?
Sure. So thank you for the question. I use those terms as legal terms. I don't think the people that I'm studying at the Kuski internment camp envision themselves as non-citizen for the reason that they had lived in the United States for quite a long time, but they legally could not gain citizenship. Their children could because they were born here, and those were the people that were incarcerated that I'm calling Japanese American citizens. So you could have a family of people who are non-citizens and citizens. At the WRA camps, or War Relocation Authority camps, there certainly was an attempt to eradicate Japanese Americans of Japanese culture. They were not supposed to speak Japanese. The schools forced kind of this Anglo-Americanization upon the children in classrooms, and they were not allowed to take photographs of families, although some people did sneak in cameras illicitly. In terms of assimilation and acculturation, in the archaeology of the Asian diaspora, originally people were trying to answer this question of like, are people assimilating, acculturating? Are they maintaining their cultural boundaries? But that's not really a question that we try to address anymore. For me, it's just looking at the material culture. What I try to understand is how people were using things in this particular context and how they were using them prior to being incarcerated. So one of the things that I've been doing is looking at Japanese American newspapers across the West Coast. Most of the people from Kuski were actually from California originally, so I've been looking at newspapers and looking at the advertisements and looking at what products Japanese Americans were using before they were incarcerated. And what you find is kind of this interesting hybrid mix of Japanese imported products as well as adopting some of these Anglo-American manufactured products to their own liking. And so some advertisements actually have kanji, which is a Japanese language at that time, as well as English describing an Anglo-American product or a Japanese import or export product. So yeah, I hope that answered your question.
It does.
Yeah.
The reason I asked it is I think this phenomenon in psychology is still a very important phenomenon. When we talk about, migrant communities, the notion of assimilation and acculturation is very important in determining what happens after.
So comments on networks down at this end?
Yeah, let me start with that because I appreciate the question about network analysis, and I tried really specifically and hopefully did not say that I was doing network analysis because I had high hopes when I came into this community that network analysis would be something useful to understand this population over time. But it turns out of the 1,100 people across 7 farms, on and off over 120 years, I only have birth dates for half of them. So pinning them into a specific location at a specific time so that I can look at the density of a network in a specific place is really difficult for most of them. So that network graph is undirected, which means there's no information going from one node to another. It is simply a connection, is a snapshot of that 275 group in 1838 because I have a single document that puts them into a single place at a single time. But all the other documents are spread over that 120 years and those places. And so as I can start to tease out more birth dates and some lifespans, I may be able to do a time series. But the kinds, as you know, as somebody who does this, the kinds of mathematical measurements that we get out of network analysis, like centrality or how dense the network is meant to be a comparative ratio. And without other enslaved communities of contemporary time and measure, it's hard for that number to have any meaning across. So I really did wish.
Nor you want to grab the mic?
A little bit more bad news, if I can deliver it. It's that there's a big data angle here, and then there's these heat maps that are not really big data. What I mean by that is that coins are a very plentiful piece of evidence, and we're trying to harvest them from wherever we can, right? But coins with spatial data attached to them are very hard to find, right? Even when we can give spatial data, these hoards are reconstructed from the antiquities market and from records, from collectors, and from police reports when there are bad things happen, bad things do happen in these kinds of places. that's where we get some spatial nodes that might satisfy a network theorist to get to the point of a significant sample. The way where like quantitative approach, I think, can help reconstruct networks in ancient monetary history are weight standards. You know, you can always weigh a coin, and I remember I was in a museum in Turkey in the village, and they said, do you have to weigh every single one, these little tiny pieces of Justinianic bronze? And sure enough, yeah, I was able to identify which emperor, which 6th century AD emperor it was based on these weight figures. So we have beneath and beyond these empires networks that are sustained by weight standards that go deeper into the past and which interlock at fixed ratios and accommodate each other. So hopefully I think when museums collaborate through means like open link data, we may get more spatial fixity there and have a chance to do something like network theory better.
Well, let me ask two archaeological questions really quickly, one for Stacey and then one for Noah. So many of the camps I know here in Michigan where German prisoners were kept had been CCC camps prior. And I assume that there might have been uses to some of these camps afterwards. So how do you deal with kind of the stratigraphy of what's in the record in relation to kind of habitation of these camps and how preserved or not preserved they are? And actually, was there a desire on the part of the government to totally raise these camps in such a way that very well may have destroyed a good amount of the archaeological evidence that we could have seen? And then the question for Noah is, are there any Rosetta Stone kind of hoards that were found? That is, do we have a big clump of coinage that was still archaeologically dug up somewhere in Anatolia, for example, that we do have kind of a real, kind of lodestone that we can actually use? Or do we not have that and continue to only be able to work off the antiquities market? Let's go to Idaho first, and then we'll go to Anatolia.
That's a really good question. Unfortunately, a lot of the World War II incarceration sites were sites of multiple occupation histories and all had their kind of very sad stories. And I think it was very intentional of our government to reuse places that were CCC camps, federal prisons, racetracks, places that were not hospitable to human habitation, unfortunately, especially when you bring large families and elderly. So my site, yes, was a CCC camp. It was a federal prison before it was a Kuski internment camp. And it was also Nez Perce land, proto-historically, prehistorically, and historically. So it did have those multiple occupation periods, and we were very aware of it. And one of the big first research questions we had is, how do we tease out the distribution of trash from these different occupation periods? After doing several field seasons and spending nearly 10 years working with the data and cataloging hundreds of thousands of artifacts from this site, I'm fairly sure that the first layer, what's on the surface, is from the World War II incarceration period because of what we're finding time period-wise. In terms of Kuski, the government didn't raise it, but they did relocate a lot of the buildings because after the war they needed them. So some of the buildings have been repurposed for Forest Service housing. And I think that was true of a lot of other of the World War II incarceration facilities. There's a lot of talk of abandonment and people leaving behind a lot of their goods when they left because they simply didn't know where they were going to go next after incarceration. And some of that land that were incarceration sites was also sold off to private individuals, which presents a challenge for people that want to go and study it, or descendant communities who want to come back and see the barrack in which their family was imprisoned. So it's a very complex history, and it depends on the site. The second, did I answer all your questions?
Yep.
Okay, good.
That's fine. Noah?
It's a great question, especially because of this Rosetta Stone angle, you have these hoards, and they're things that people by nature did not come back to. So if you're talking about a mother lode of precious coinage, something pretty bad happened, pretty drastic, to create that archaeological record. And in Anatolia, do archaeologists dig those up? And ideally, a hoard that, like a Rosetta Stone, will show us, will unlock interactions between different monetary systems, different cultures. Yes and no. One example would be, there's a classical 5th century BC hoard of silver coins from the highlands above the southern Turkish coast, and it has an Athenian decadram, a very rare coin, huge Athenian, almost wonder if it functioned as a coin, a place called Elmala. So this would have been a Persian governor's residence, and these would have been stored up there. It was dug up by looters. It was pieced back together by Turkish police. I went there last summer. People, what do you know, didn't want to talk to me in the village. It's an interesting case because it'd be hard to find that on a map of the classical world, if I was teaching it. These are the treasure houses of despots, of kinglets, of the governors, the satraps of the Achaemenid Persian Empire in Anatolia. And one that was dug up by French archaeologists, actual archaeologists. I could add a place called Kaye. You've got a fortress that has reliefs that would be at home in Persepolis. It's the only place with Persepolis-style reliefs, like in the Mediterranean world, in the West. And it's taken over by Alexander's successor, the Ptolemies. They have possessions outside of Egypt. So this is their fortress in the mountains of southern Anatolia. And yeah, they found 3,000 silver coins there. And this is a paymaster's purse. These are the piggy banks that Alexander's successors took over. And on a hoard like that, you can pin down the chronology of the entire century. But it is a particular kind of a deposit and won't tell us as much as the Rosetta Stone to unlock the kind of interactions. It's that one commander of one empire lost his life and never came back for the fund for the garrison. So those are the kind of things we have. But it does occasionally happen that archaeologists find these kinds of deposits, but more often than not, it's the police putting them back together along with numismatists.
So, other questions or comments? Stacey?
So I have a question for you. Actually, I have two questions. So first, have you been able to look at how pandemics affected individuals, like certain subsets of the population, like age groups or genders?
Yes, in fact, our most recent publication, which was co-authored with an honors college student from MSU, it came out in the American Journal of Epidemiology, and our focus there was what it did to pregnant women and to their babies. Because we know, and you've probably heard this, even today, that pregnant women are particularly vulnerable to influenza. And the strain of influenza that circled the globe in 1918 was the H1N1, which is still quite prevalent in the world. So we took a very close look at that, and we found some evidence that was perhaps unsurprising and some that was quite surprising in light of earlier research. So I'll give you one example. There was a paper that came out a few years ago that purported to find that, so deaths from the pandemic peaked in October 1918 in Michigan and in most parts of the world. And what this paper reported was that 7 months later, after the spike in deaths, we see a dip in births in these areas. Now, if 7 months after a mortality spike or a flu spike, you see dips in births, what does that suggest? It suggests that women who are pregnant and in their first trimester of pregnancy are losing their babies, right? So this is something that they call fetal loss. So this was interpreted as a phenomenon of fetal loss. When we looked at data from 19 states in the United States, so much more closely, they looked at the entire country aggregated, so different states which had slightly different patterns were all put together. When we broke it down across the 19 states, we found that the pattern was quite different. That in fact the lag between the mortality spike and the dip in births was 9 months. And 9 months means something wholly different, right? You're no longer thinking about fetal loss, you're probably looking at failure to conceive as being, because the gestation of a human baby is 9 to 10 months. So this was a very interesting finding, and it came out of data, again, large-scale data, in this case on health, on births and deaths, which you get from census records.
Interesting. And then the second question is, have you been able to apply this to modern day census records to predict where pandemics may occur or how they might affect certain areas of the country or other parts of the world?
Right, so predicting where they may occur is an extremely difficult job. One of the reasons the 1918 pandemic is such an attractive event to study is its scale was so massive, both in numbers of people affected and in geographic sort of scope and scale. So the numbers are so large that even if they are not being accurately reported, the timing of these peaks is very evident in the data that you see. I mean, even if there may be underestimates of deaths or people getting sick, you know when it's happening. You see spikes in the data. So it's very useful to study it to try to get an idea of, okay, you see a spike in this country at this time. When do you see it somewhere else? What does that tell you about how the whole world is interconnected? So for example, Taiwan, which is a Japanese colony, has a very similar pattern of mortality and a variety of other outcomes from the disease to Japan. And of course, the reason is it's part of the Japanese empire at the time. So in terms of predicting, not too much, but in terms of telling us what happened in that case and then thinking about what that can tell us about today, I think it's quite a useful phenomenon to study.
Well, at this point, I think what I'd love to do is get any questions from the audience. So if you raise your hand, then Stephanie will come with her microphone, and she might have a question or two herself as well. Please do raise your hand.
I have a promotion, though. If you have enjoyed the panel tonight, over by the cookies is an email sign-up sheet. So go ahead and grab a cookie and sign your email up for any future panels. So I'll pass it over here.
Thank you. I had a quick question about Indonesia. How are they currently taking census and head count now, especially up in the mountains? I know that's an issue like in Southeast Asia because it is very mountainous. How are they taking census or like head counts?
I don't know the details of that. The areas that I study are very densely populated. There are mountains there too, but they are a lot less remote than some of the other mountainous areas. My guess is they have census, so they will have different regions that come under different sort of branches of the broader Census Bureau. And they usually have people who are trained to go from household to household and ask the questions that they need to ask to get whatever data. So how many people in the household, what are the genders, what are the ages, and perhaps when they're interested getting data on education and health and other types of things. How reliable are the data? I can certainly say that they're a lot more reliable today than they were in 1961. They were a lot more reliable in 1971 than they were in 1961. But I think that's probably the limit of my knowledge of what they do in the more remote areas. My areas of focus are Bali, which is quite accessible and heavily populated, East Java, which is very densely populated, and Central Java, which is also densely populated.
Great. Does anybody else in the audience have a question for the panel?
I think you've got one right over there.
Nope. Sorry, didn't mean to wander away.
Thank you. I have two questions regarding the coins. What were some key identifiers in distinguishing the original coins from the replicas? And then my second question is, when these empires created their coins, was there any intent or idea of how they would be perceived or used hundreds of years after their era has ended?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, coin imitations. I mean, you mean the ancient imitations I'm talking about at the periphery of their world, right? Sometimes, the term barbarous imitation almost seems right. Like, these are a little kid's drawing of Alexander the Great's face. Sometimes they really do look like the engraving skill just wasn't there. Other times, we look for control marks on these coins, There's the big image and then there's the little image. And actually Hellenistic coins are a big, wide visual field for ancient art. So they include small control marks, which really are like the Da Vinci Code of, we struggle to understand them, but they are clearly regulating what's real, what's not real, and control of many different mints under one king. Whether they thought what they may have thought about how they might be perceived. It's a vicious, anarchic world, the Hellenistic world. If you read Machiavelli, this is the world he's talking about, actually. He's steeped in it, and he was looking for a world in which kings and city-states tussled in a zero-sum game. So I don't think many of these kings who put their faces on these coins thought too much beyond their own lifetime. But for the indigenous who are adopting this Greek way of life, I'm sure people saw this as a lasting record of cultural choice. What exactly that cultural choice was is for us to interpret, and I was sort of pointing at that this is an open question when I said we call this the Greekish period, when it's one of Greek culture's interaction with a wide number of interactions which produces something new. But certainly coins were not very well known in many parts of the Middle East, which had sophisticated monetary systems of their own, but we find these coins from India to Spain in this period.
Let me just follow up, Noah, just because I'm fascinated by, all of us probably in the room collected coins at one time or another in our life. In thinking about coins, often they actually represent value. That is, that this is a dime versus this is a quarter versus this is a 50-cent piece. To what degree, when they were minting coinage, did it represent anything other than the actual value of the metal that was in your hand? I mean, was there any kind of complexity to the financial system understanding coinage and the limiting of minting of coins versus continuing just to knock those little puppies out?
Right, so the distinction is between what we call fiduciary value, right? Our money is just paper, but we all agree to trust that it's worth this unit $1, and its value as precious metal in the case of these coins. And since coinage was born in the 6th century BC, when we're talking about the 3rd, 2nd, 1st century BC, people are used to this as a medium of trust. And so rulers have a certain latitude to play with that trust. And just a nice example would be the Athenians had sort of set 16 or so grams as the dollar, the silver tetradrachm of the classical Athenian Empire in the 5th century. And those 16 grams of silver is taken over by Alexander, and we find it all over the Near East? Well, starting about the early 2nd century BC, when Romans, they don't just conquer you and take you over. They conquer you and charge you a huge war indemnity like the Germans faced after the First World War. And so to pay for these indemnities, we see the old 16-gram silver tetradrachm, the Seleucid kingdom, much of the Near East, kind of creeping down in the 15s, 14s, dangerously close to the reduced standard that the Ptolemies, because they have the population cage of the Nile, there's nowhere to go, you have to use their money, even though it's lightweight and has a huge amount of fiduciary value added to it. But this lessening on the international market of the old Athenian standard, it works for a while, but then others start to creep down. So they watch these things very closely, and they trust, but they verify, and we can see there the slippage between, coin as money and coin as bullion. If we knew the amount of bullion that circulated alongside the coinage, this is one of the great quantitative questions of ancient monetary history, when the Roman triumphs are described as wagons overflowing with gold vessels next to coins. If we knew how to put those two figures together, how much bullion, how much non-coin money and how much precious metal bullion it was in the system, we could approach a number of macroeconomic questions better.
We have a follow-up real quick.
Just one more brief question. In your research or your knowledge, were any empires aware of the bacteria or potential diseases that their coins might carry for the times and for the future?
That's a very imaginative question I don't know that they think in those terms, so probably not, but I think there's a little question there too about where they, like you said, where did they think this thing was going, this image was going, and do they imagine that it will go so far beyond their territory? They don't want the coins to leave their territory. They don't want the precious metal to leak out of the territory. And the way you do that is you add fiduciary value, and you say, here, this is worth more. I'll give you that, and you'll pay taxes with it and so on, but they're really worried about it leaking out.
Do we have any other questions from the audience?
Other question over here?
This is for Stacey. I'm curious about the camp. Did you find any feminine products like a comb or something that maybe your husband would have brought with them in the camp?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And one of our crew chiefs who was working on our project had worked at Amachi internment camp, which is in Denver, and that was one of the WRA camps for Japanese American citizens. It was huge. It held 8,000 to 10,000 people at one point. And she had hypothesized that we wouldn't find any Japanese export or import ceramics at the time because she didn't think that men would like those beautiful objects. And lo and behold, when she was there, we found a number of Japanese export and import ceramics at the site. I think there's some in my slide. If you just Google Kuski, you'll find them. We also found this beautiful vase that was manufactured starting in the 1890s with a dragon on it. That someone, it had been about this big, and someone would have had to carry it and really kind of cradle it and take care of it to get it to Kuski in one piece. Maybe it broke when they got there and that's how it ended up in the landfill, but this was clearly an antique that someone was curating. It could have been sent in the mail by potentially a wife or a grandmother or someone, but that was a surprising find to find that. So we do know, I'm using Jane DeLucier's words here, who's also studied material culture in Japanese American internment camps. We do believe that they were re-territorializing their landscape with things that were familiar, and I think those are some examples of what they were doing to do that. So, yeah, thank you.
So how much were they allowed to bring in the camps?
That was one of the questions that me and a student were trying to answer because there's varying opinions on it. And We know there's a story of people being able to bring one suitcase to incarceration facilities. I think it depended on where people were going. So in the larger ones, some Japanese American citizens were told that their goods would be stored by the US government. And in those storage facilities, a lot of people never retrieve their goods after incarceration. There's stories of people leaving suitcases with neighbors at hotels and never retrieving those. So there's kind of this sense of loss and abandonment. Even if people had those goods, it doesn't sound like a lot of people actively tried to retrieve them after incarceration. And I think part of that is because people weren't really sure where they were going to go. I know with some of the people from Kuski, they went back to Japan and then came back to the US. They went back to a town that they were left or were forced to leave, and then they went to another town. So there's kind of this continued story of displacement and loss after incarceration, which I would like to study as a future research project as well. I have a lot of them after this project.
Two follow-up questions, Stacey, just because the fact that the other two kind of historical artifacts that would make sense in this case is, did internees actually have some form of checklist of things that they brought with them so that the government would say, yes, this is what Mr. and Mrs. Lee or whoever happened to bring? Question one. Question two is, do we have actual photographic evidence from the inside of these camp buildings so that you could actually see things in situ? That is, there are the things that were on a dresser, there are things that were on a bed table and so forth.
So the second one, the photographic evidence is pretty problematic, especially at the larger WRA camps, because the people who were commissioned to take the photographs, which included Ansel Adams and Dorothea Lange, were told to take certain kinds of images of people to really make it look as though it wasn't a terrible experience for people. And so the way photographs, even from Kuski, the way they were taken, it seems to convey this image of order and happiness that I don't think really existed from the oral histories and material culture and archives. So yes, you can use photographs to reconstruct that. In fact, I have a photograph of the barrack. I think it's the only one I have of the interior of the barrack with some decor, but you have to ask, why are they taking this and why are they showing this, and kind of interrogate the media that's being given to us. Could you repeat the first question? Sorry, it's been a long day.
Yeah, the issue of checklists. Did people have to actually have lists of things that they brought in?
So I haven't seen a checklist. I've seen photographs prior to incarceration of people packing up their goods and some of the things they were bringing with them. But I think that they expected, for many people, they expected to be continually displaced, because some people went to what the government called assembly centers, because the government didn't have a place to physically relocate 120,000 people in such a short period of time. And so then they were put in other incarceration facilities after that. So if they had a checklist, I'm guessing that they had to get rid of some of the things they were bringing because they simply couldn't do it, or the government said they were going to store them in a certain place. The Kuski folks, some of them had been to 2 or 3 incarceration facilities before ending up at Kuski. So they had been to several different places before ending up there, and probably had to pare down their goods because of that.
Any last questions from our attendees? Because I'm going to open it up for, yes, over here.
With the dental artifacts that you found, can you still possibly get or extract DNA from them?
Could you say that first part of the sentence? Sorry, I didn't.
With the dental.
Oh, the dental.
Yeah.
So we don't have any human teeth, thank goodness, because when we find human remains on archaeological sites, everything stops in the US, and we have to call the coroner and notify, if you're working on tribal land, notify the tribe. So the teeth we found were molds of teeth that were probably used to make like teeth in a denture, or put a tooth in someone's mouth. But no, I don't think so. Luckily, we did not find any teeth. But yes, I think you can do it on other archaeological sites. And the question would be, would we want to do it ethically? And is that family still a family we can get in contact with? Because this is a sensitive subject. We do have FBI files for all of these people, but that's not something we've made public. So yeah, it would be a question of why do we want to do that and what do we want to find out specifically. But it's a good question.
So I think we'll close there, John. go
Yes,
ahead.
so any last comments or questions from our panel in terms of anything that we've talked about tonight? Anything that you want to make sure our audience knows, both online and in the room? Well, let me thank you all for coming, both on the feed. We want to thank the Alumni Association, who always is so nice to underwrite the live streaming. I want to tell you that the next Sharper Focus Wider Lens is on Monday, April 1st in this very room. It's called The Varieties of Healing, and it's going to be a fascinating panel as well. Please help me thank our panel tonight. I think they did an outstanding job of helping us dig up the past. Thank you so much.